Among the best parts of the Sherlock Holmes stories are the offhand references that Holmes throws out and then never mentions again. In last month's story, The Adventure of the Three Gables, he asked his client if she happened to have a Shakespeare First Folio. In today's story, The Abbey Grange, he tosses off another, only slightly more obscure reference, to Watson this time. The case had started out badly for our heroes, as the story told by Lady Brackenstall seemed to fully explain the crime and point directly to the perpetrators, and all that was left was for the local constabulary to round them up. But of course, Holmes's powers of observation and deduction lead him to question the initial solution, and soon he goes from giving up on the case entirely to believing he sees a successful outcome within his reach. He expresses this to Watson as, "We have not yet met our Waterloo, but this is our Marengo, for it begins in defeat and ends in victory." What are these battles, and why does Holmes think they suit the current occasion? To answer that, we need to go all the way back to the French Revolution. I'm not going to try to summarize the history of the Revolution, mostly because I don't know it that well. But it's popularly supposed to have started with the storming of the Bastille on July 14, 1789, still celebrated as Bastille Day. The revolutionary period is generally considered to have lasted until the coup of 18 Brumaire in 1799, when our pal Napoleon installed himself as first consul of the French consulate. During the revolutionary period, the French found themselves producing more history than they were able to consume, and they ended up exporting a lot of it. For one thing, there was a whole lot of guillotining of aristocrats going on, and for some reason the monarchs of neighboring countries found this unsettling. And when monarchs feel unsettled, wars often result. The War of the First Coalition, lasting roughly from 1792 to 1797, represented the first attempt by Prussia, Austria, and Great Britain to push back against the anti-royalist fervor. It didn't go well for them, with the French not only holding their own, but actually adding some territory. After a brief peace, while everyone tried to catch their breath, the War of the Second Coalition started in 1798. Remember Marengo? We're finally getting there. The War of the Second Coalition was the next attempt by France's nervous neighbors to put a lid on the bubbling revolutionary cauldron. This time, a lot more of them joined in, with Britain, Austria, Russia, the Ottoman Empire, Portugal, Naples, and various German monarchies getting into the act. But even with this bigger force, the coalition didn't manage to defeat the French revolutionary government or regain the territories that France had conquered in the First War. In April of 1800, the Austrians made a surprise advance toward Genoa, Italy. To counter their offensive, Napoleon led his army across the Alps to Italy, and he and his horse looked very heroic doing it. By June 9th, the French were closing in on the Austrian army at Alessandria. Based on bad information from a double agent, Napoleon moved large parts of his forces to the north and south of where they really needed to be. On June 14th, the Austrians launched a surprise attack on the diminished French forces near the village of Marengo. The battle has been studied endlessly by military historians, and you don't need all the gruesome details, but the essence is that Napoleon started at a definite disadvantage, and things looked very grim for him for the first half of the day, but thanks to his amazing military instincts, he turned it around, and by the end he had chased the Austrians back to Alessandria and inflicted major casualties. He also scored a major political victory and secured his grip on power back in France, paving the way to become emperor. The War of the Second Coalition ground on for a while, but it was essentially over by the end of 1801, with France once again the victor. Thanks in part to the military genius of Napoleon, the coalition members all ended up signing peace treaties that left them no better, and in some cases worse off than before. And the Battle of Marengo became shorthand for snatching victory from the jaws of defeat. So, the Second Coalition is done for. Napoleon is firmly entrenched in Paris and just itching to crown himself emperor. Time to relax, right? No, time to launch into the bulk of the Napoleonic Wars. We've got 5 more coalitions to go as Europe tries to keep Napoleon from realizing his dream of becoming emperor of just about every place that's any place. So from 1803 to 1815, Europe wallows in blood and slaughter, France gains and loses ground, Napoleon advances on and then retreats from Moscow during the most refreshing part of the Russian winter, and a wonderful time is had by all. But by June of 1815, even those fun-loving Europeans had had enough, and one of history's most decisive battles took place near the village of Waterloo in what is now Belgium. The 7th Coalition Army, yes, we're up to 7 now, in a gloriously complicated campaign, routed the French and put the final nail in the coffin of Napoleon's imperial ambitions. By the evening of June 18th, it was all over but the surrendering. The Duke of Wellington, shown here looking quite proud of himself, had led the coalition troops to Napoleon's last defeat. Napoleon abdicated 4 days later, and coalition forces entered Paris on July 7th. The defeat at Waterloo marked the end of the First French Empire and set a historical milestone between serial European wars and decades of relative peace, often referred to as the Pax Britannica. In popular culture, the phrase "meeting one's Waterloo" has become an expression for someone suffering a final defeat. So what does all this have to do with Holmes and Watson? Remember Holmes and Watson? At the beginning of the adventure of the Abbey Grange, Holmes is thinking he's wasted his time, the case is settled without him, and he might as well slink back to London in defeat. But then he spots the 3 wine glasses with the telltale beeswing in only one of them. As Watson says, he had lost his listless expression, and again I saw an alert light of interest in his keen, deep-set eyes. This feat of observation marks the moment when he realizes that what he thought was his Waterloo just might become his Marengo after all. The Abbey Grange was published in 1904, almost 90 years after the Battle of Waterloo. But Conan Doyle believed, quite correctly, that the references would still resonate with his readers. The Napoleonic Wars left a major impression on the British psyche. In the same way, we Americans, 80 years after World War II, still have a strong emotional reaction to mentions of Pearl Harbor and Iwo Jima. But what's interesting to me is that when Holmes refers to Marengo and Waterloo, he's seeing them through the eyes not of the British, but of the French. Marengo was a French victory, Waterloo a French defeat. And the way Holmes sees them is the common way Englishmen, and just about everyone else, would have seen them in 1904 and today. As the adventure of the 6 Napoleons shows, Napoleon was such a larger-than-life figure that the British came to look on him as a military hero who transcended nationality, rather than a national enemy. As larger-than-life figures go, we Sherlockians are lucky to have not one, but 2 who tower over literary history, just as Napoleon towers over military history. And we can be confident that, unlike Napoleon, Holmes and Watson will never truly meet their Waterloo.